While Lori is
streaming live on Facebook.
It says live on Facebook up at the
Right.
top.
It does. It said that last night too. Lying sack of. Does it? Does anybody know Diane DeVries? I'm sorry to pop in, but she's in the. I don't have her on my list, and she's
Diane DeVries.
Yes.
Diane DeVries.
How do you spell the last name?
It's my mother.
A little D.
Diane DeVries is my mother.
Okay.
Oh, then I'm definitely letting her in.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I am going to start recording, and then I'm going to disappear and turn it over to Janet. I will first say just a word about MWA. I am Lori King. I am the president of the NorCal chapter of Mystery Writers of America, which is a fabulous organization that everybody should join. Anyone interested in writing certainly should join. And if you're interested in reading, we'd love to have you. We have a Facebook page. We have a website. We have email if you need to get in touch with us. And we welcome all kinds of people doing all kinds of things. This is the second in our 2020 Mystery Week. We have 7 events, 30 plus writers talking about all kinds of topics. And I hope you enjoy it. If you have any questions, I am available. Write me through the MWA site. And I'm going to turn it now over to Janet Rudolph, who will identify and introduce herself. Thank you, Janet.
Ooh, okay, great. Thank you, Lori and Lori. I'm Janet Rudolph, and I don't have to look at my screen for this because I know who I am. And I am the editor of the Mystery Readers Journal, and I blog at mysteryfanfare.com every day about things that are going on in the community. Most of you, I figure most of you know me. I don't know. It's not about me tonight anyway. So we're just going to move right along. My job, though, as moderator, is to keep the discussion going. And I would really love our panel to be interactive, kind of a round table or a square table, kind of rectangle. We have little heads, right? Instead, that's the plan. But having moderated panels at mystery conventions for the past 45 years or more, I hate to say that, but it's true. I know it doesn't always turn out that way. So it will go in its own direction. I do have questions. I have things prepared, but I'd also like our panelists, and I will introduce our panelists, I would like the panelists to talk to each other. That would be fine. So I'm kind of on the side, and I will interject with some questions, but then we'll see what happens. So I'm going to start with Priscilla. I don't know where you are. I know where you are right now for me, you know, on the screen, but that doesn't mean it's the same place for everyone else. So I'm just going to start with Priscilla. Priscilla Royal writes The Prioress Eleanor, Brother Thomas, 13th Century English Mysteries. She grew up in British Columbia and got a degree in world literature at San Francisco State. After graduating, she vanished into the federal civil service for over 30 years. Dark hole there. Then she emerged to enthusiastically commit historical mayhem. 15 of the series books were published by Poison Pen Press, and I did see the editor of Poison Pen Press here in the audience. I saw her as she flashed by. Priscilla's 16th and latest, Elegy to Murder, is her first independent publication. Hal Glatzer, Hal, wave, in case we don't know it's you. Okay, is an unconventional author. His 3-book mystery series published by Perseverance Press features Katie Green, a working musician in the years leading up to World War II, whose gigs, of course, lead to danger. Hal himself is a musician, and I have been privileged to hear him play at Left Coast Crime in Hawaii, actually. He performs popular music from that era. He also is a traction buff, explanation, an enthusiast for streetcars. And that led him to self-publish a big, he calls, Mishner-size historical ebook novel, Dead in His Tracks. And it covers the rise and fall of streetcar lines in America from the 1890s to the 1960s. big period of time. And it's set here in the Bay Area, starting with the discovery of a skull in the Emeryville mud flats. Janet Dawson is the author of 4 historical mysteries set in the early 1950s. The California Zephyr, did you wave? I didn't know if you waved. Okay. California Zephyr series features protagonist Jill McLeod, who is a Zephyrette, the only female member of the crew of the sleek streamliner that runs between the Bay Area and Chicago. Jill began sleuthing in Death Rides the Zephyr, and the 4th in the series is arriving in the station in Death Above the Line. She also has the long-running series featuring Oakland private eye Jerry Howard, and other things. I mean, we all have other things, right? Jacqueline Winspear, perhaps no introduction needed. I don't know, very short introduction, because I'm going to let you all talk about it, is the author of the Maisie Dobbs series, following the exploits of the renowned psychologist and investigator Maisie Dobbs through her time from World War I to World War II. Have you gone beyond World War II, or we're still in world, kind of getting up there, right?
We're still in World War II. Yeah.
I thought
yeah,
so.
Yeah.
Her latest book, though, is a memoir called This Time Next Year We'll Be Laughing. And we sure hope we're all going to be laughing this time next year. But I'm going to allow her to talk about that. So what I usually do on panels, and I'm glad this is somewhat visual for those who are watching. I know, you know, not everyone who will watch this later, because it's being recorded, will be able to interact, but put questions in chat starting now at any time. But I have one question kind of for everyone. Not all the questions will be for everyone, but I think because all 4 of you write great historical mysteries, the question is, why did you choose the period you did to write about? And I'm going to give Priscilla credit for that. So let's start with you, Priscilla. Why did you choose
Okay.
your period? And tell us a little
Well,
bit
part
about
of it,
of course, at the same time.
Okay, well, part of it is I did grow up in Canada, so I got a lot of British history, but I'm also a contrarian. When I hear something like, oh, that's just the Dark Ages, or, you know, it was a primitive period and that sort of thing, particularly compared to the Renaissance, my first question is, wait a minute, you don't get to the Renaissance until you have something happen back here. So I started reading and found surprising to me. The art, people is very primitive. They didn't know anatomy, you know, and that sort of thing. They didn't have perspective. But that's like saying Picasso really needed to study anatomy. It's a message, not necessarily what we have perceived to be art. So the human form has less importance than what is pictorially presented as the message of the artist, which in most cases was religious, obviously. Music was, well, you know, all that chanting was lovely, but it really, you know. But several years ago, I had the opportunity of going to hear a liturgical drama in Berkeley called The Play of Daniels. It was a 13th century work. And when I saw it, it only took maybe about an hour for the performance, but it was like a small opera, a very simple opera. It had primary characters, and it had a chorus, and it had a plot, and it had a lot of action going on in it. And I thought, this is not primitive. This is very interesting. It's very exciting. It's very engaging, because one of the things that most people understand, certainly in the period where literacy was not primary, was that the visual action will teach you whatever it is you want taught. And so I thought, well, okay, this is exciting. We forget that they had a wonderful sense of humor. All those up in the cathedral roof areas of people making grimaces and doing strange things, which perhaps might be a little embarrassing, was all part of the sense of humor of the Middle Ages. They are also not puritanical in any way, shape, or form. If you look at the tapestry, Bayeux Tapestry, lots of stuff is going on down at the bottom that is hardly puritanical. I found the era very surprising, very interesting, and varied. One of the things I also found that I thought would be pertinent to our own era is that there were many examples of how people managed to justify doing things that were contrary to common conventional wisdom. For example, my characters belong to an order of monks and nuns called the Order of Fontainebleau. Double were not unusual. Most of them were primarily before the rule of Rome came into effect. And monks and nuns married at that period of time. After the rule of Rome, celibacy became the rule. And we still had monks and nuns occasionally living in close proximity. They did in the Order of Fontainebleau, which was a French order with daughter houses in England. But the most cases.
We're going to stop because we're getting frozen.
Was one instance where.
Priscilla?
Oh, okay.
We're going to come back to you because you get frozen every once in a while. I don't know why. Your computer.
That's okay. I don't take
coming
it
back. Janet Dawson, why did you choose, okay, and the question is not just why did you choose the period, but the specific. Priscilla talked about nuns and monks, and so why did you choose a Zephyret? Why did you choose that time period as well?
Well, first of all, the old California Zephyr ran for a specific amount of time. It was inaugurated in March of 1949 and came to an end in March of 1970. So I wanted to write about that particular train, and I had to do it in that time frame. It was petering out toward the end. People were driving, people were flying. So I wanted to write about the old Zephyr in its glory days, which would have been the early 50s. I also chose the first book takes place in December of 52. The subsequent books have taken place in 1953. My Zephyret became a Zephyret because her fiance died in Korea. So I had to have the early 50s time frame while the Korean War was still going on. By the time we get to the summer of 1953, the armistice is coming into play in Korea. But in the first book in particular, my protagonist's fiance died at the Battle of Chosin Reservoir, which was in December of 50. So I have a scene where she's thinking, well, it's been 2 years since my fiance died. I don't remember when I first heard about Zephyrets. I have been something of a train buff for a while. But when I heard about Zephyrets, the only female member of the crew, she was like a stewardess in the early days on an airplane. And I thought, well, I have to write a story about a Zephyret. I figured a Zephyret would be perfectly placed to be a sleuth. This is a person whose job duties are to see to the needs of the passengers and to be observant, to be able to identify problems, anticipate problems, and act. So I thought that a Zephyret would be a perfect sleuth. And I was fortunate to find some retired Zephyrets when I was doing my research, but more about that later.
Okay. Jackie?
I had to unmute myself there. I've taken the California Zephyr. And just very quickly, my husband as a kid came across from East Coast to West Coast on the Zephyr, and he was talking about it a few years ago. And I said, well, why don't we just relive that and do it again? And I just loved it. I loved every second of it. You know, it was wonderful. Anyway, be that as it may, I didn't choose my time period, it chose me. And very quickly, you know, growing up in England, you have history and you don't even realize it. You've got history in your face all the time. You know, I used to live in a house, the last house I owned before I came to this country was built before America was quote unquote discovered. So it was built in 1450. So I'm, you know, and growing up, you have ancient history sort of drummed into you. So you know your ancient history. But funnily enough, we didn't have things like World War II or World War I because it wasn't really considered history when I was a kid. It was just, it was too recent. But I knew it all the same through my parents and grandparents, and very, very much so. So it chose me, and it chose me quite literally, because the whole idea for Maisie Dobbs literally, I mean, I won't go into that story, but came to me while I was stuck in traffic. And it's hardly surprising because I'd always been interested in the era about which I write. I've always been interested particularly in the lives of women during that era. You know, it's been said by historians that the 20th century didn't start until the First World War. And the impact that it had on women in Britain was quite massive. They were the first generation of women in modern times to go to war in great numbers. And by that, I mean in their millions. Everything, I mean, literally, there was no field of endeavor left untouched by a woman's hand. And I had always found that a very compelling story. My grandmother worked at the Woolwich Arsenal, and that's where she lost the sight in one of her eyes due to an explosion while working with heavy explosives. So the lives of those women fascinated me. And plus, that time period between about just before World War I, right up until the end of rationing after World War II, which actually went on until the end of 1954, going into 55, which is an awfully long time. And it was almost like you know, they all say it was another 30 years war. So I found all of that story compelling. And whilst at the time I thought I was only ever going to write one book, when I realized that I had the material for a series, I was able to think about how I wanted to structure that series, how I wanted it to look and feel. And if the truth is that, you know, mystery in the very purest sense of the word, and when I think about it, it means, you know, it's that archetypal journey through chaos to resolution, and maybe not, as the case may be. Times of war offer the perfect opportunity to explore all manner of social ills within that framework. And I think how better to do that than within the literary form we know as mystery. And you can touch all sorts of things. I mean, everything from you know, for example, my next book in the Maisie Dobbs series is called The Consequences of Fear. I mean, and what are the consequences of fear? And yet I can wrap that up in a mystery with this protagonist that has gone through some very fearful situations. So it chose me. It quite literally chose me. And I think one more point, and then this is about history in general, and that is that, you know, we ascribe periods of time, we give them limitations. First World War, 1914 to 1918. Second World War, depending on where you come from, 1939 to 1945 or 1946. And yet wars don't end neatly in that period of time. And I saw that as a little girl when I saw my grandfather's wounds, you know, and he was picking shrapnel out of his legs until the age of 77. And that shrapnel went into his legs in 1916 during the Battle of the Somme. All of that, you know, I think the mystery offers such a rich framework with which to explore that a period of time. So that's me. It chose me.
Thank you. Hal, why did you choose? You have two different time periods here, but why did you choose them? Or take one? Voice, we can't hear you. Nope.
I had myself on mute. Sorry about that. I chose Katie Green's era of the music of the 30s, the late 30s, because that's music that I play. I play basically what's popularly called the Great American Songbook, which loosely defined from the turn of the century to about the 1960s or so. As far as the streetcar plot, which was my working title for Dead in His Tracks, the streetcar plot, as Jacqueline says, it chose me. Streetcars in the modern sense, the electric streetcar arose in the 1890s and had largely vanished from American cities by the 1960s, mainly because of two things. One was what we now call suburban sprawl, and the other was quite literally an antitrust conspiracy of oil and rubber and motor vehicle manufacturers that put a lot of pressure on streetcars, which had never really been upgraded after the Second World War. American cities would look rather different if we had kept the streetcar lines the way, for example, the European cities kept their streetcar lines. So the eras really chose me. And I would like to mention to Janet that I just took the California Zephyr the very beginning of this month. My wife and I took advantage of an Amtrak sale and had a bedroom on the Zephyr to Chicago and a roomette from Chicago to Penn Station in New York. I'd be happy to give you some experience, share some of the experience, but it was not quite as good as the trains I first took in the 60s.
Absolutely.
So Priscilla, you haven't been on the Zephyr, is that true?
No, actually, I don't fly, so I do nothing but train.
This is a train.
I've taken the Zephyr many times. I think it's one of the most beautiful trips I could even imagine. But I started taking trains in the 50s because my mother and I would go from Vancouver, BC to Seattle on the train, to do shopping, whatever. So, I go way back on trains. So I love Janet's series on the Zephyr. I think it's fabulous.
It's fun.
It's really fun. This is a fun.
Oh, yes.
I think we're all train buffs because I absolutely adore trains. I love them to bits. I'm always planning to, a couple of years, was it 2 years ago, did the Rocky Mountaineer with a friend, and I've been on the Alaska Railroad with the same friend, and she said, can we just one day do a trip when we don't go on a train? No, no, why?
Why, exactly,
really
why?
Train panel, right?
It's such an important part of America's heritage, and as an immigrant to America, I'm so aware of that. And when I went on the Zephyr, I know we're not here to talk about trains, but before we got on, I guess it was a station manager or whatever in Emeryville gave such a wonderful talk about what it means to take a train and what it is. You're going across this continent and you're going to places where you could never get to in a car or whatever.
No, you can't. No.
It was just wonderful, just the most wonderful experience. And if someone had told me you can sit on a train for 3 days and you will not get bored, I think, well, I'm a bit of a fidget. I just loved it. I just I could have looked out I did look out the window for 3 days. It was just wonderful. Wonderful. Although I have to tell you, my husband and I had to swap the bunks because I said I want the top, and then I said I don't feel very well up here, so I was just thinking I was getting a little bit woozy. Anyway, sorry, not my. I should give that to someone else. Sorry, it was just wonderful.
No, it's Sunday night. It's a weird time in the area. Sorry, you're not here, Hal. So I have a question, and anybody can take this, and you can pass it around if you'd like. What is the most unusual thing that you found out during your research, and were you able to use it?
Oh yeah.
Okay, Janet.
I mentioned earlier, I discovered that there are retired Zephyrettes, and I was fortunate in that two of them lived in the Montclair section of Oakland. One was a woman named Kathy who had been a Zephyrette on the last run of the old California Zephyr before it closed down. And the other was a woman named Radna, who had been a Zephyrette in the early 50s. And she was the era that I was writing about. So one night I met them for dinner at Krogan's over there in Montclair. And I bought them dinner and I turned on a recording device and talked with them and just listened to them for 2.5 hours. And at one point I asked the question, well, when you were a Zephyrette, what would have happened if there'd been a murder on board? Would you have radioed ahead to the next station to say, hey, we've got a suspicious death? And Radna, the one who'd been a Zephyrette in the 50s, went, this was the 1950s. You couldn't radio ahead to the next station. She said that the train would have to stop and the brakeman would climb the nearest telegraph pole, tap into the wires, and send a Morse code message.
Oh my.
So of course I had to use that, but that's an example of something that crops up when you're writing what I call the 20th century historical novel. You think you might know what you're talking about because in this day and age, well, of course we could radio ahead to the next station. But you have to think this was December of 1952. The technology didn't exist at that time.
Mhm.
I was always finding out all these wonderful little tidbits to use.
I think that's one of the wonderful things about writing the historical mystery is that you have to slow things down because of that. You can't suddenly whip out a cell phone, you know, whatever. You have to slow it down. And I think that gives you a chance to bring such richness to the whole experience and to bring tension in because nothing's that fast, you know. Today, you know, say with everything we have at our disposal, often the tension is ramped up because of the speed. But now we have the opportunity to ramp up the tension because of the slowness compared to today, which I think is that's a wonderful example. You know, I have one thing that I don't even know if it was a discovery, but I used to. Well, I obviously haven't been for a while now, but one great resource for me is the Imperial War Museum in London. And using the archive there, and I think they put the archive in a different place now, but when I was using it for the most part, it's in the old dome. The Imperial War Museum, by the way, is housed in what was the Bethlehem Lunatic Asylum. Bedlam, it was called Bedlam in the local, you know, it's in Now, isn't that a great place for a museum of war, Bedlam? And it was in the chapel, so you're in the dome. And before you have to book your place, and then you tell them your research very specific research interest, and they, on the place that's already waiting for you on a beautiful oak desk, there will be boxes of letters plus books and various other records and references for microfiche or whatever, because you expect to spend at least a day there. And in those boxes are collections of letters. Now, not necessarily letters from famous people, but over the years, people, you know, if you find someone's letters stashed in a wardrobe after they've died, and it's all letters sent during a time of war, they'll be donated to the museum because it's a social history. Anyway, it was when I was doing the research for Pardonable Lies, I wanted to know specifically, get a sense of experiences of British servicemen, particularly aviators, in France at a specific period of time. And so I was going through these old letters, and you come to this job with great respect because you realize that sometimes you are the first person reading every letter since the recipient got it in their hand, because it's not from a famous person, and it was just catalogued when it came in and put in a box and put away. And so I realized, and it was after reading Four Lots, there was something that occurred to me, that there was a point at which in each letter I found it harder to read because the writing became fainter. So I went back and I realized that point was the point at which they were deployed to France. All the time they were in England, I could read the writing because the ink was flowing nicely. But as soon as they got to France, it wasn't. And I thought, why was that? Why did that happen? And I suddenly thought, okay, so all the troops converging on France and Belgium from not only Britain, but the British, Empire. So it was hundreds of thousands of troops. I suddenly thought, oh, they must have had a run on ink. They must have watered down the ink. And it was the only explanation I could come across. And I suddenly sat back and thought, what does that mean if you're just about to go up the line and you're knowing that when you went up the line to the front line, only 2 out of every 5 would come back, and that was on a good day. And you're writing what could be your last letter home. How would, and there's the big question we all have to ask, which is, how would I feel if? And I just sat back and thought, oh my God, what a terrible feeling. It would be like being a service person now in Afghanistan, and you're going out on patrol and your instant messaging has just gone down. What do you say? What do you do? And it must have been quite, and no wonder they then went to pencils, because it was the ink was just seeping through the paper. And there have been many situations like that where it doesn't seem to be a big thing. It's often that little thing that gives you a chance to write a very rich piece in addition to your story. Anyway, sorry, probably took too much time there, but it was a real, I can remember feeling really, asking that question, how would I feel if, and my heart was breaking, thinking, gosh, I can just imagine that tension of thinking the ink's just going through the paper, because the paper was probably thin then.
Very thin.
And it was just going right through. Very sad. Anyway, thank you.
I think one of the things that I found
think the two-
fascinating was memory. How much people could memorize during the time, because when I was growing up, for instance, we had to memorize everything in school. We weren't taught to read by rote or anything like that. We were taught to memorize all the words, and we had to memorize vast amounts of poetry and that sort of thing, none of which, of course, I can do anymore. But it did teach me why it was in the Middle Ages that people could recite vast amounts of information or stories because their memory was trained. And the same with observation. You didn't have forensics. You didn't say, oh, well, I've got this blood thing, I'll send it off to somebody and they'll figure it out for me. You had to observe, use your experience, consider, and be very thoughtful, and bring everything you know to a situation to be able to come to a conclusion. It was all in your head. It was where the amateur sleuth actually had a great deal of value, because in many cases, that was the only person they had.
And isn't it also to some extent true that it was only the clergy were allowed to read and read from books to some extent, because not everybody could read, and therefore there was
not everybody. Yeah, not everybody could read, so a lot of it was oral tradition.
Communication. Yeah,
right. Oral tradition.
Hal, anything that you found?
Yeah, I actually, I'd always heard that there was this conspiracy against streetcars in favor of roads and automobiles and buses. But the big reveal for me was actually going to the south side of Chicago, where there's a federal archive. This was in the late 80s, and actually reading the transcript of the antitrust trial, which was held in Chicago. That was fascinating. This was before the internet. It may or may not now be available online, but there was no such thing at the time. I had to sit and take notes, although I did have what then passed for a portable computer that I could take notes with my fingers, with typing, not just by longhand. But I drew upon the transcript in the section of the book that takes place during the trial. I have to admit, I augmented it a bit. I combined some people into individuals who were actually separate people, but this is what historical novelists do. In fact, one of the questions that I wanted to pose to people is, to what extent do you include real people from your era in the stories that you write? Are there actual historically valid people who make an appearance, important or trivial, in your works?
Yes, I have done that. I've put politicians in my work, and it's a cameo, and they're in and out very quickly. I don't make them major characters. I have, however, based characters on other real people, and you know, to some extent. And I tend to give a little clue, and very few people get the clues, which is great. You know, a similar name or whatever. But you know, yes, I've had real the odd real, which is why I always, you know, I always catch it when I have to say to my publisher, because they put that thing at the beginning, you know, there's a, I can't even remember the exact words. I'd have to grab a book that, you know, that this is a work of fiction and these are not real people. And then I suddenly say, well, actually, you know, Stanley Baldwin was a real person, you know, and this person was real. And well, don't worry about it, because you've, well, okay, fine. And you know, Edward R. Murrow was a real person, you know. Anyway.
Priscilla, did you put any real people? Did you, when you were doing your research?
I did put in, actually, I have the feeling that if I could write real people, I probably wouldn't be writing fiction. But I did throw one in, that was Castile, the first wife, in the last chapter of one book. And I really wasn't happy with her portrayal, although I find her a fascinating character. Mostly what I want to portray in my books is the effect of decisions of real people, political, religious, and what have you, rather than actually portray the real person. If I tried to put Edward I in a book, he would take it over, because he is such a monumental character about whom people have strong opinions, pro and con. So he would take over the book. I would end up writing a biography of Edward I. So I tend to avoid actually portraying real people.
Janet?
Not done it so far in my mysteries. I am starting a historical novel, which will have some real people in it.
Not a mystery? Or
Not really.
okay. And how you post the question, so let's answer it.
Oh, well, in terms of the antitrust trial, I used several real names, but I made use of them. They're all dead, so there's no libeling the dead. But I certainly put words in their mouth based on what they said in the trial. Actual trial testimony, anybody who's ever read trial testimony from anywhere, you know it's not book dialogue. You need to make it into dialogue. This is a bona fide requirement, or else nobody will turn the page. But I've dropped a couple of names when I was doing the Katie Green books. I dropped in the names of some real people in order to position my characters in their time. I reference real band leaders that the women in the band have worked with, but they are not, those real people are not actually characters. They are there as anchors for the reader to grasp where these women are coming from musically.
Actually, I think Hal's made a very good point there, and I think it's something we do look for when we're researching, even though we don't know we're doing it, and that's that every opportunity to anchor the book in its time. And that is, and you can do that with, music is one of those great ways to do that. And and I know that in my books I've often brought in song. You know, there's a song in the background, there's a band in the background, because it's something else that anchors the book in its time, along with everything from food to means of communication and so on and so forth. And I think that phrase, I've used that myself in the past, anchoring a book in its time, and I think it's really important. I'm glad you mentioned.
I use movies a lot
I also,
the books that take place in the early 50s. I use movies to say, oh, all right, well, this movie came out in July of 53, so we'll mention it.
At what time or what point did you
I
bring up
also,
research and start writing?
sorry.
Oh, sorry, Hal. Hal?
Oh, well, I was just going to say, for Dead in His Tracks, I did something I had never done before. The book took almost 20 years from the time I started to the time I actually released it. And one of the things that took a lot of time was that I wanted it illustrated. And since I was writing an alternative history set in real time, I went around everywhere to flea markets and antique malls and things like that. And I prowled through old photographs that had come from people's estates that their relatives obviously never wanted, or they wouldn't have been turned over to dealers. And I plucked out photos of people who looked like my conception of the characters. And I inserted them into the book with and identified them as my characters. I also got some historical photographs of the key system in Oakland, and I altered them a bit, or actually had them altered by somebody that can do Photoshop better than I, and called it my books system, the King wrote. I also put a disclaimer in the book saying that I make no representation that the people you see illustrated are actually the people in the book. And I explained where I found the photos and stuff like that. And where I needed to get permissions, I got permissions from archives and stuff. But I wanted the book to be lavishly illustrated to appear as if it were a true history.
Cool. So anyone want to add on that? So you have these wonderful ideas. You have all your maps, you have everything. When do you decide you've done enough research and you start writing, or are you writing along and adding things? Which way do you do it? I guess that's what I'm asking.
For my part, I don't think these are in a way separate tasks, because the most important thing you're doing is writing a story. I'm not writing narrative nonfiction. I'm writing a story, so therefore my story is the most important thing. I think if you have an interest in a subject, and usually it's an interest in a subject that makes it either choose you or you choose it, you've already got inventory. You've already got inventory to draw upon. But then for me, it's as I'm writing, what else is there specifically I need to know? And I use those big poster size post-it note things that you stick on the wall, and I'll just scribble it down. And I think I can find that out any point. But what is most important is the story. And I think if we start thinking the research is more important, then the research, we start to lose track of the story. And instead of the research supporting the story, we can lose ourselves as storytellers. And so really it's kind of going on at the same time. And very often in my research, I'll come across things and I think, whoa, that's something I want to use for a book in the future. So it's kind of bubbling there. It's inventory. And I can draw upon that inventory every time. And just very quickly, I've always looked at research as something sort of like an iceberg. Only 7% of it should be seen above the surface. Everything else that you discover, that you uncover, that you keep notes and files about, will inform every single word. But otherwise you've lost the story, and it just becomes a vehicle for you writing about your research. And I've read books where I've thought, that the writer has come close to making that error. Whereas you start losing the story and it just becomes like the story of their research. And instead of this vibrant story filled with characters and events around something. I don't know whether that I've made sense in the way I've explained that. But...
No, you've made perfect sense because the story is the important thing, and one of the research has to be integrated into the story, so it's part of the story. That's why I said what I did about you have to sense the period. You have to pick your details, and in my case, I specifically chose my time frame so that it would cover certain things in history that I wanted to cover and how it impacted on my characters. So that when I approach each book, I decide which year it's going to be, what's going to go on in the background, what in that background is going to influence my characters and what they must do, can't do. And it's going to be part of the plot. It can't just be, oh, by the way, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue kind of thing. It has to be, the action has to be part of the story. So yeah, you make perfect sense.
I find that.
Yes, you have to.
Go ahead, Hal.
Oh, I was just going to say that the giveaway is, you know, you have a scene in the Vienna cafe and somebody says, "Oh, look, there's Beethoven. Come on over. I'll introduce you, but you'll have to speak loudly. He's deaf." You know,
Mm-hmm.
it's moments like that that sort of make you close the book and go get a drink.
Janet?
I would agree with Jackie. I often don't know what I need to research until I get to that point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's that too.
I'll start out. I've got a Jerry Howard book I'm working on now that I started, and it wasn't until I got to a certain point that I decided, well, I need to find out something about Alameda, California police procedure, because I need certain information before I can move ahead in this particular segment. So I went online, I went to the Alameda Police Department website, I found the person in charge of the investigations section and wrote him a long note explaining that I was not a strange person, I was a writer. And he got back to me within the hour and answered the question. Now, interestingly enough, I already had a theory about how they would operate in this circumstances, and for the most part I was right, but it was really good to get that information when I needed it so that I could move ahead with the next phase of the story. So yes, I write and then I do the research while I'm muddling along.
Well, I think you run into questions because
Right.
in one instance, I was writing a book took place in Priory in England, and I was looking at the geography, and I thought, oh, there's a river there. But there was, and I included it in the plot, and then I thought, wait a minute, there's something about that river I don't like. So I wrote to essentially the Chamber of Commerce of the town in the area, and they sent me pictures and information and reference to somebody that I could ask questions of, and that wasn't a river at all. It was a canal that was built in the 19th century. So I had to immediately change my. But you do run into things, as Janet said, about, oh, gee, I don't know anything about that. And that's integral to the plot. And I better get it right, because if I don't get it right, somebody is going to, it's going to say, hey, you missed something here, or you were wrong here. And you do get that from readers.
Actually, because we've got some train buffs here, I'm going to give a plug to one of my quote unquote sources. And because I think sometimes transportation is just one of those wonderful ways that you can anchor a book in its time. however the transportation is. And I had to get someone from Paris to Munich, and Journey to Munich. I mean, that's the title of the book. and so I found I got in touch with this guy, and if you look, I'm trying to remember his exact website. It's something like seat69.com or whatever. And he's a complete train buff, a British guy that used to work for British Rail back in the day, but has been all over the world in trains because it's his thing. And he's got train timetables going back years, decades. And he looked up and he said, okay, well, she can go from Paris to Stuttgart, and then she has to change to a regular first class carriage, and then she can go to Munich. And what is amazing, and so it's that kind of thing, getting the detail without ramming it down someone's throat. You have it be part of the experience. Oh, she has to hurry to get her connection or whatever. But what's great about that particular guy is that he doesn't charge you any money. He asks for donations, and everything goes to the Syrian Children's Fund, which I think is brilliant. But I think it's that finding, and I love it when you realize you're writing away, and I once had Maisie Dobbs. She's on Tottenham Court Road. She had a car accident. I wanted her to have some sort of dressing, but I didn't want her head to be wrapped in bandages. And I thought, gosh, it's 1929. Did they have what we call in Britain, elastoplast? You call them band-aids. Did they have them then? And then I wrote to someone at, I think it's the Wellcome Foundation that had a whole history of medicine and so on. And he said, they were just being invented, and they were not given to regular doctors, but they were available for testing in casualty departments, i.e. what we now call A&E, what you would call the emergency department. So I just so had it that the doctor that treated her happened to have some with him, because otherwise in 1929, you could not have a Band-Aid stuck on you. You had to have a bandage. But I think those moments that we dive into give us an opportunity for that anchoring, give us an opportunity to stretch something out, another piece of dialogue, which adds to that sense of time and place, and even can add a really important plot point.
Okay. Since we are in COVID, I think we do have to hit.
Yes, you have to pay attention to that sort of thing.
What happens now?
I'm seeing a photo. Here we are.
But I'm sorry.
You have to pay attention to. No, that's right. You have to pay attention to what's possible. When I do the Katie Green books, I mean, she uses a tooth powder because really there was no toothpaste in the modern sense of the word. There's little details make all the difference.
Or just salt or bicarbonate of soda or whatever it was that people used to use.
Oh yeah, all kinds of things. A question has to do with, I started to mention in the time of COVID, Jackie, you said you had gone to the War Museum, right? And you had done some research and you found the letters. Now that we're in COVID, and has this impacted you, or do you still have a lot of stuff saved up? Or
I have everything I need for what I need to write so far. And that's the great thing. I do have inventory to draw upon. And what I'm drawing upon now that I'm in the Second World War is actually family memories, family stories, which I have in abundance already. But everything I'm looking up now, I can do with books, I think, to a great extent. And I'm reading well beyond what I need just to get the sense of what comes next. So no, it's not. I've done a lot. I've done so much that I can draw upon. I've walked the battlefields of the Somme and Ypres. I've been to various places. Gosh, I was born and raised in Britain, and I remember going from our house to London to see the relatives and still going through bomb sites. I mean, and that was in the 1960s. I mean, my cousins and I used to play in bomb sites, and you have a real already it's right there, that sense of time and place. So at the moment, it's not stopping me. Although I really like to travel. So, you know, I'm glad I'm not writing Journey to Munich right now, because I would be really bummed if I couldn't go to Munich. So yeah, that will affect people.
Al, anything changed?
Not much has changed in history. I'm usually pretty satisfied with the research before I start writing, but I also am open to small things. When I put Katie Green on the SS Lurleen en route from San Francisco to Honolulu just before Pearl Harbor, I actually had the deck plan of the original Lurleen open on my wall. It was part of the brochure that came with the maiden voyage that had the full deck plan. So I could actually show how I could actually work out how long it might take for someone to get from one part of the ship to the other. And that was also very useful, because then I wasn't overcoming time and space. And again, that's also useful when you're writing history. You can't introduce anachronistic things, but you also can introduce anachronistic time. Unless you stop a chapter and start a new one, you can't have something just flit from place to place. They really had to take a bunch of time to get from one physical location to another. And you need to reference the mode of transport. Somebody mentioned earlier that you want to include the mode of transport, because that also gives you the time. If it took 4.5 hours on the train, you need your character to have 4.5 hours transpire between scene 1 and scene 2.
You also couldn't have any really quick getaways unless the engine was running in a car, because there were various steps to get a car going years ago. You know, you couldn't just boom and off you go. You know, I mean, in my era that I write about, you know, there was a 5-step process. I mean, you'd be nabbed long before you got away. But actually, you're talking about COVID. I really, I'm going to have to save up for this, but something I really, really want to do, because it loops into the book that I'm going to be writing, not the next one, but the one after that, but it's something I want to get out of the way. I really want to go up in a Spitfire. And, you know, to do that, I mean, I know there's places I could do in America, but I really want to do it out of Biggin Hill. And I've got to go to England for that. And I would hate to think I can't do that sometime next year, you know, so. I'll report back on that one, because I'm not a good flyer.
Yeah, we're going to wrap up in a minute, but I wanted to just ask, what advice would you give to someone writing an historical mystery? One sentence, 2 sentences. You don't all have to answer. Anybody can answer. Do you have any advice?
First of all, really quick, never forget your
time.
Never forget you're a storyteller first. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
Storyteller first.
Hal?
Oh, I was taking the opposite tack. I was saying, be sure of your history. You can tell a good story, and if it's really a good story, it could be set in any time, in any place, with any nationality. But if you want to put your story in a particular time, in a particular place, the Middle Ages, the early 1950s, the years between the 2 world wars in the 20th century, then you really have to be sure of what a person living then would have thought, felt, and stuff. You can't be anachronistic in the interior if you're anachronistic in the exterior.
Anyone
Well,
else?
I would piggyback a little bit on that and say that human nature is universal. We haven't changed at all, probably since we stood up on 2 feet. But our frame of reference is different. One of the things that surprised me about history is how often people thought or said things that we would consider to be modern, because we're arrogant enough to think that only we know the most and the best. And that nobody in the past had ever thought about it before. However, you have to be very careful that if you choose something that is modern, It has to be phrased in a way that they would have phrased it in your era. And that includes the symbolism and all the rest of it.
Janet?
I think I would agree with Hal in that you have to be true to the era you're writing about. I have read a number of novels where I've been thrown out of the story because the writer got something wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I think Priscilla is right. People are people no matter what era. So a little bit of both.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I see a question from the audience, and this is for Janet Dawson. You've written 2 separate historical series, and now you're starting on your 3rd. How do you keep it all straight in your mind?
I guess I'm good at compartmentalizing, because if I'm working on one book, that's where I am. I'm present in that moment. And if I'm working on one of the California Zephyr books, I'm in Zephyr mode. The Jerry Howard book that I'm working on right now has a lot of echoes back to the 60s and the 70s. So I'm in Jerry mode. But it's just compartmentalizing, keeping myself separate, those stories separate.
And another question, and don't forget, people in the audience, if you do have a question, put it in caps in the chat, so we don't think it's just chat, but it's really a question. Thank you. Another thing that I'm just wondering, what are you working on now? Obviously, I see that one. What are you working on now? Anybody want to share?
Well,
I just finished. Okay, go ahead, Janet.
I'm working on a Jerry Howard book. I honestly didn't think I had another plot for a Jerry Howard book in mind, and then all of a sudden this one cropped up. So I decided to go with it.
Okay. Priscilla?
Well, I just finished which at least the e-reader version in Kindle is out on Amazon in September, and I'm still trying to get the paperback together to publish as soon as possible. But the next book is going to, for 2021, is going to be tentatively titled Prayers of the Dead, and is probably best described at this point as dealing with one who far too much for.
We're having trouble there. Hal? Hal, what are you working on?
Yes, I actually just finished a book that I'm trying to find an agent for. It's not historical. It's actually set in the modern day with cell phones and internet and things, but it is what I think is a unique take on the trope of husband and wife sleuth partnership, accidental detectives who find themselves caught up in a murder. I think I have an original angle on that, and I'm trying to interest an agent in it.
Jackie, do you want to tell us a little bit about your memoir?
Oh yeah, my memoir. I've got it here. Published on November 10th, which is 2 weeks' time. And I think it's 2 weeks or just over 2 weeks. And it's called This Time Next Year We'll Be Laughing. I didn't make that up deliberately for this year because I came up with that title quite a while ago. It was something my dad used to say when we went through difficult times, and there were quite a few difficult times. And it was really funny. I remember it's like as a kid, he had, when I was a kid, he'd say that, we'd be at the dinner table or something, and say, oh, never mind, this time next year we'll be laughing. And it really was I think the attitude of a generation that came through such terrible times as wars and goodness knows what else. But I always remember the minute he said that, it was as if, he'd thrown out a line into the future with a grappling hook on it, and it landed on a rock and you could pull yourself in. But I realized I wanted to tell very much my parents' and grandparents' stories, because just one little snippet when my parents were first married, it was in the years after the war. They were just 21 and 22. It was 1949. There was nowhere for a young person to get to live in London because of the bombings. You had you didn't have, if you were an ordinary person, different if you were rich, but ordinary working class person, you ended up with the in-laws. My parents stood that for a very short time when they saw a gypsy caravan being advertised for sale in the paper. And they borrowed the money, they bought it, they had it towed down to Kent, which was a very rural area in Kent, and they became farm workers and, to all intents and purposes, traveling folk. And they did that for about 5 years until I came along, 5-6 years. And that was at a time when you would see signs in pubs and shops, sort of no hoppers. Hoppers were hop pickers. No hoppers, which also meant no Londoners, and it was saying no gypsies, no travelers. And they had a good old time and a very adventurous life from that. But I think their journey really inspired my brother and I. So there's a lot about that. This time next year, We'll Be Laughing comes out in 2 weeks' time. And then in March, I've got the next book in the series featuring Maisie Dobbs. It's called The Consequences of Fear, and it's coming out March 2020. So I'm pretty busy right now. And I'm working on another book after that. So no peace for the wicked.
Well, this is a terrific panel. This is wonderful. Thank you all so much. Are there any questions that weren't asked that you just want to answer anyway? Ask it yourself or answer. I don't want to cut anyone off. If there's something else you want to share with people about writing the historical mystery or your own.
Janet,
Yes.
Janet, this is one of the Lauries speaking from the darkness. You had a question from Jan Boyd asking, how thoroughly do the writers feel that they need to understand their era in order to write convincingly about it?
Should I just start off on that one?
Do.
I tell you what it is. It's not, I think you get to a point where it's not as if you're on the outside looking in, you are in. You are living your era. And particularly when you're writing, you are so completely there. And I will give you an example of that. Here I am in California, and we've had some pretty hot days. So as we do in California, there are days when I'm working away in my office. I have the curtains closed because I don't want loads of sunshine coming in and burning my eyes, apart from anything else. But I'm so immersed in my time that, I suddenly think, I'll stop for lunch. And I go outside and literally I go, oh my God, it's like a shock. I feel as if it's a shock that I'm suddenly, here I am in the 21st century, because you become a time traveler. I think you immerse yourself in your time so that you can almost taste it, and you immerse yourself. And this is another thing I think with research in the language of the time. So for example, my grandmother wouldn't have said, I won't be doing that. She would have said, I shan't be doing that. Mm-hmm. She wouldn't do it now. She would do it presently. There are all these little things. So I think immersion, that's what you do. I'm not on the outside looking in. I have to be in. I hope that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
That leads to the inevitable question, it seems to me. Would you like to live in the era that you set your stories in?
Oh.
No, I wouldn't, but then
like
I sometimes don't like to live in the current one either.
I'd like to go back. I'd like to go back and visit. I would like to go back and take a ride on the old California Zephyr the way it was in 1953. But I wouldn't want to go back and live in 1953. I was there, but I was very young then. So yes, if I had a time machine and could go back and visit, but I'm quite happy living in the 21st century.
In many ways, I almost feel like I lived it, because someone asked me not so long ago, do you feel that you're a child of the 50s or the 60s? And I laughed. I said, I feel like I was a child of the Edwardian age, simply because, you know, where I lived, it didn't feel as if it had changed much from that time. You know, we were my parents were called the young couple, and they were still being called the young couple 25 years later, you know, after we moved into this particular house. And there were a lot of elderly people in the area that had, you know, that's where they were rooted in that time and had gone through so much. So I always felt that, you know, I was growing up at a different time. And then I go to school and it was different, of course. And my cousins in London, for example, to me were just so hip and different than me. So, but we have so, you know, many more things now, don't we? And by things, you know, I had a very bad accident in the house when I was 15 months old. And my parents never stopped telling me that I was really lucky because they could give me antibiotics. Because, you know, antibiotics hadn't been around very long by the time you got to even 1957, you know. And all the things that, and this, I suppose, and I really don't want to ramble, but I think in a way, you know, this is why perhaps COVID has come as such a really big shock, that we have lived in a charmed age for a long time. Although that's not for everybody in the world, it's certainly not the same if you're in Syria or in parts of Africa and so on. But in the Western world, we haven't had big world wars. We haven't had a major pandemic. But I remember when I was a kid seeing people lining up to get their polio shots, to get their smallpox, you know. Even at the turn of the century in Britain, you know, I don't know how many, 2 in 5 kids died of diphtheria. You know, people were killed the first 2 years of the war. Way more civilians were killed than military. So we've lived in a charmed age where we've become very, we don't understand risk in the same way that people used to understand risk. So for that reason.
My mother had typhoid fever as a child. I don't know that you hear of anybody in this country having fever anymore.
Not in this country.
I remember getting the polio vaccine. Yeah, that was a big.
Oh,
my mother cried when they came out with it because she knew that I wasn't going to get it.
Yeah, I had one of the first polio vaccines, the Salk vaccine, as a schoolboy. And of course, growing up in New York in the late 40s and the 50s, polio was a real threat. And it was a miracle for my generation. I'm a baby boomer. It was a miracle for my generation that we pretty much didn't have polio. You know, I mean, I always like to say I'm answering, you know, my own question here, but I would love to have lived in the 18th century. I would love to have met Jonathan Swift and Alexander Pope and Samuel Johnson and all these wonderful people. But I would like to have penicillin, if you please, along with that.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, I think it's you know, it's all very nice when you think of playing dress up, but not so nice when you think of the everyday life. I mean, when I think of you know, I was reading something that I wrote ages ago about my grandmother. I didn't put this in my memoir, that, you know, it was not long before she married. She went to visit her brother, who was in hospital and dying. He had come home from France and he was dying from his wounds. And she refused to wear white to her wedding because she couldn't, because she was in mourning. She refused to wear white to her own wedding. And, but then we also have people coming home from overseas now, you know.
We have one more question. It was, I'm going to change it a little bit. I hope that's okay, Joe. He's asking this question. And I asked this question of you before. Are there any other historical mysteries that you read or that you could recommend, even if you're not reading the series or their series? Anybody have any books to recommend? You don't have to recommend someone else. You're all wonderful.
Well, I would say, okay, go ahead, Hal.
Okay, this Zoom thing.
There are two series there are two series that I have been devoted to ever since I first started them. The Brother Cadfael series by Ellis Peters. It's a pseudonym, but as she's dead, there aren't going to be any more, but I was fascinated. I read every single one. But the other is the Marcus Didius Falco and his daughter Flavia Albia, set in first century Rome by Lindsay Davis. And I have, from the very beginning, I have never left. Every time a new one comes out, I put in an order for it. And as soon as it's published, I get it. I will never stop until she stops. It's just been a fascinating, and it opened up Rome to me when I first visited Rome. It was after I had read her stories, and I found it a great guide to early imperial Rome.
Amelia Peabody.
I'm sorry?
Amelia Peabody by Elizabeth Peters. I have enjoyed those books so much and learned so much about Egyptian history.
Well, she wasn't
And
Egyptologist. Yes.
I would mention Sharon K. Penman because she not only writes beautiful prose and is a wonderful storyteller, but she integrates so beautifully into her stories, so that even in historian, you're not beaten over the head with details. They're part of the story. The other writer I would mention, because, and one book in particular, and I love Peter Robinson, but he wrote a book called In a Dry Season, where the murder or the crimes were committed during World War II, but had implications many years later in modern times. And he's one of those, it was one of those situations where he was able to integrate both the modern time and the past so beautifully that it was really very satisfying. It tends to be a clunky way of doing things. It's difficult to do, and he did it seamlessly.
Any other questions? Any other recommendations? Anything we forgot to talk about? Cats? We saw a cat. Only saw one cat.
Yes, we saw a cat.
His name is Bodie.
So
He's
So
adorable.
I wanted to thank this fabulous panel. We've all been watching, and I think we have kept on to our participants. Nobody's gone to bed yet. So here we are having a party. Thank you so much, everyone. I think this has been a really great panel. I am going to shut out the Facebook Live, but if anyone wants to put on their video and come on screen and have a chat with any of these people, we're happy to keep it open. So
this is the cocktail part. So come on, grab your